By the summer of 1944, the battlefield in Normandy no longer announced itself with trenches or front lines. It revealed itself through movement. Roads, once neutral lines connecting farms and villages, had become the most dangerous terrain of all. Not because of who stood on them, but because of who watched them from above. A German commander moved along one such road in a plain staff car, stripped of ceremony and insignia. There was no escort, no column, no visible authority. This was not humility, it was survival. In a war dominated by Allied air power, rank had become a liability. The more important the man, the less remarkable his appearance needed to be. The sky over France no longer belonged to those beneath it. Allied fighters and fighter bombers passed overhead in relentless cycles, scanning the countryside with disciplined indifference. They were not searching for medals or generals. They were searching for patterns. A vehicle that moved too confidently. A line of travel that suggested purpose rather than fear. Motion itself had become evidence. The instinct guiding the commander was rational and modern, disappear into routine. Become indistinguishable from the traffic of a collapsing army, supply vehicles, messengers, refugees of circumstance. In earlier wars, anonymity had offered protection. In 1944, it offered only the illusion of safety. Because plain sight had lost its meaning. Modern war no longer required identification, it required interruption. Allied air power did not need to know who occupied a vehicle. It only needed to know that the vehicle mattered. A car that stayed on the road. A speed that implied urgency. A route chosen for efficiency rather than desperation. These details, invisible to those inside the car, were legible from the air. If the camera lingered, it would not focus on the man, but on the road itself. A narrow ribbon cutting through hedgerows and fields, unchanged in appearance, transformed in purpose. What once carried farmers and families now carried risk measured in seconds. No warning signs marked the danger. No trenches explained the rules. Only open sky, calm and unchallenged. The shock does not arrive with violence. It arrives as recognition. The commander's greatest enemy is not an Allied general planning across a map. It is visibility, the unavoidable truth that in this war, to move is to speak. And somewhere above that ordinary road, unseen observers were already listening. After the Allied landings, German command confronted a truth that could not be argued away with doctrine or resolve. Daylight movement had become punishment. Night movement, exhaustion. Between the two, there was no longer a safe rhythm, only degrees of risk measured in fuel, nerves, and chance. Across Normandy, vehicles learned new habits. Trucks were pulled beneath trees. Staff cars vanished into hedgerows. Tanks, once symbols of dominance, waited motionless beneath camouflage nets, engines cold, crews listening to the sky rather than their orders. The landscape itself became cover, used instinctively, almost desperately, like animals avoiding open ground they no longer controlled. Orders still moved through the system, pencil lines on maps, clipped phrases over radio, but survival no longer depended on clarity alone. It depended on timing measured in minutes, on camouflage that fooled the eye from one angle but not another, on luck that could not be scheduled or commanded. A road taken too late in the morning might as well have been mined. A delay of seconds could turn routine movement into catastrophe. Yet the commander refused to remain behind walls and wires. He insisted on visiting the front, not as theatre, but as conviction. Leadership, he believed, had to be physical to be real. A commander who did not see the ground could not understand it. And without understanding, decisions became abstractions, neat on paper, disastrous in execution. His aides urged restraint. They spoke in careful terms about air patrols, about windows of relative safety that were narrowing by the day. They proposed alternatives, messengers, reports, delegated authority. The commander listened, then answered with urgency. The defense was failing. Time was compressing. Only direct observation, he argued, could reveal what maps concealed and radios softened. This was the tension the system could not resolve. In a collapsing army, presence could be courage, a refusal to surrender judgment to distance. Or it could be vanity, a belief that personal will could still bend a battlefield shaped by forces far overhead. The difference between the two was not philosophical. It was practical. And it would be decided on the road. Because the new front line did not run through fields or villages. It ran through the air. The sky had become a barrier no infantry could cross and no rank could negotiate. It enforced its rules without warning and without exception. The fuse was lit quietly. The commander chose to travel. And the road he entered was governed by laws already written, by altitude, by speed, and by eyes that never needed permission to look. The staff car moved early, before the day fully claimed the sky. Dawn offered a narrow margin of hope, a belief shared across the German front that the first hours of light still carried a kind of quiet, a pause before Allied patrols thickened and roads became untenable. The engine stayed steady. The pace was controlled. Nothing about the movement suggested urgency. It was, in every visible way, ordinary. Above the hedgerows, a fighter pilot swept the countryside at low altitude, eyes trained not on spectacle but on detail. Roads were read like maps written in dust and shadow. Intersections, bends, straightaways, each was assessed for signs of life. A faint plume behind a moving vehicle. The brief shimmer of glass catching sunlight. Motion was never isolated, it was interpreted in context. Inside the car, the commander believed himself protected by restraint. No flags marked his presence. No escort widened his profile. He travelled without ceremony, convinced that normalcy itself had become camouflage. In a landscape crowded with retreating units, supply columns, and civilian movement, anonymity felt rational, almost prudent. From the air, the calculation was different. The pilot did not look for rank or intent. He looked for behavior. One vehicle held a consistent speed. It stayed centered on the road rather than drifting toward cover. It moved with purpose, not confusion. It was neither overloaded nor erratic. Too clean. Too direct. Too alone. These were not accusations. They were indicators. The first pass came without warning. Gunfire tore downward in a brief, controlled burst. Glass exploded inward. Metal folded and screamed. At treetop height, air power was not distant or abstract, it was immediate, intimate, and final in its judgment. The road, moments earlier a means of connection, became a place of impact. In seconds, roles collapsed. The commander was no longer a man shaping decisions across a front. He was weight and blood, pulled from a ruined vehicle by hands acting on instinct rather than orders. The car, stripped of meaning, burned or lay silent, it no longer mattered which. Overhead, the pilot circled once, confirming damage, then moved on. There were other roads. Other movements. The air war did not linger. It recorded outcomes and advanced. The shock was complete, not because of the violence, but because of its efficiency. In modern war, authority did not have to be defeated. It only had to be interrupted. And on that quiet stretch of road, morning light revealed a new truth: command could be erased before it ever had the chance to speak. The commander believed the front could still be stabilized. Not through speeches or proclamations, but through discipline, through the correct placement of reserves, the tightening of lines, the enforcement of order where erosion had begun. In his mind, the situation was not yet lost. It was misaligned. And misalignment, he believed, could be corrected by clear judgment applied at the right point. That belief rested on speed. Not speed of movement, but speed of understanding. He was convinced that if he could reach the front, see the ground with his own eyes, and cut through layers of filtered reports, he could make decisions faster than the enemy could exploit confusion. Maps were useful, but incomplete. Radios carried facts, but not texture. The truth, he believed, still lived where boots met soil. At headquarters, the language remained stubbornly familiar. Staff officers spoke of counterattacks, of restoring coherence through will-and coordination, as if determination could compensate for shortages of fuel, ammunition, and air cover. The vocabulary of earlier campaigns persisted, even as the conditions that had once given it meaning had vanished. Words like flexibility and initiative survived, detached from the reality overhead. The commander's worldview had been shaped by a different phase of the war. He had learned his craft in campaigns where maneuver solved problems quickly, where movement created advantage rather than inviting destruction. In those years, boldness had been rewarded. Commanders who appeared at the decisive point could still bend events through presence and timing. The sky, then, had been contested. It had not yet become hostile territory. His staff understood the danger, even if they did not challenge the belief behind it. They approached the problem technically. Routes were adjusted. Departure times recalculated. Camouflage refined. Risk was broken into components and managed like a logistical equation. If exposure could not be eliminated, it could at least be reduced. This was not defiance. It was professionalism working within limits it could not change. But beneath these precautions lay a deeper assumption, rarely spoken aloud, that command itself could remain mobile under an enemy that watched continuously. That leadership could still travel, observe, and intervene as it always had, even when the air no longer belonged to it. This was not arrogance of personality. It was arrogance of system, a belief carried quietly by an entire institution shaped by earlier success. For the commander, belief hardened into confidence with each delay. The longer he remained away from the front, the more he felt coherence slipping beyond reach. Reports arrived late. Situations changed faster than they could be described. Every hour of absence felt like surrendering initiative to forces already pressing hard. If he could just arrive once more, just see the situation directly, he believed he could impose clarity where confusion reigned. What he did not fully accept was that clarity itself had become dangerous. That the very act of moving to understand the battlefield now exposed him to a force he could neither command nor evade. The confidence that had once defined effective leadership now carried a different weight. And so the belief endured one more journey, one more inspection, one more intervention. He did not know that the system he trusted was already measuring that belief, not as resolve, but as motion. German units adapted not through doctrine, but through necessity. Across Normandy, discipline became improvised and deeply practical. Headlights were masked or removed entirely. Vehicles were spaced far apart to avoid presenting a single, tempting cluster. Movement was pressed tight against hedgerows and tree lines, where shadow could still interrupt a pilot's view. The open road, once a symbol of speed and coordination, became something to cross reluctantly and briefly. Camouflage ceased to be exceptional and became routine. Nets were thrown over trucks and guns at every halt, whether planned or accidental. Trees were no longer scenery, they became architecture, columns and ceilings in a fragile shelter against observation. Barns and farmyards turned into temporary headquarters, their civilian familiarity repurposed as concealment. War folded itself into the landscape, trying to become indistinguishable from it. Communication followed the same logic of restraint. Radios were used carefully, sometimes sparingly, because signals created patterns even when vehicles did not. A transmission repeated at the same hour each day could be as revealing as a convoy on a straight road. Silence, once dangerous, became a form of camouflage. Orders were delayed. Initiative was localized. Coordination frayed slowly, but invisibility demanded a price. Commanders learned to look ordinary. Rank was hidden beneath dust and canvas. Maps were folded away. Staff cars were stripped of markings and moved without ceremony. Authority, once reinforced by visibility, now survived by concealment. To be noticed was to be targeted. To blend in was to live a little longer. Anonymity became protection, practiced not as deception, but as habit. Yet the enemy adapted as well. Allied pilots no longer searched for symbols of importance. They searched for behavior. Ordinary was not a guarantee of safety, it was simply another category to be examined. A vehicle that moved with intention. One that followed efficient routes rather than desperate detours. One that obeyed traffic discipline instead of scattering like civilians. These details separated the harmless from the useful and the useful from the expendable. Inside one such vehicle, a small human detail captured the shift more clearly than any report. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. Not from fear of ground combat, but from fear of the sky. Every stretch of open road demanded a calculation. Every second in motion felt exposed. The war above dictated the tension below, even when nothing could be seen or heard. From these habits, a doctrine of disappearance began to form. Move less. Move later. Hide better. Speak carefully. Assume you are being watched even when you are not. It was not written down or formally taught. It spread through experience, through wrecks by the roadside and gaps in the chain of command that no one could quite explain. But the doctrine rested on a fragile assumption that observation was imperfect, that the sky could be fooled by patience, by camouflage, by routine made deliberately dull. It assumed limits where the enemy was steadily removing them. Air superiority was no longer just about destruction. It was about interpretation. And as German commanders learned how to vanish, the battlefield quietly learned how to see through disappearance itself. Allied air forces did not need to destroy everything. By the summer of 1944, they had learned a more efficient truth. It was enough to punish movement selectively, to strike often enough that the entire system slowed under the weight of fear and delay. A tank destroyed was useful. A tank forced to remain hidden all day was often more valuable. Fighter patrols became a form of control rather than pursuit. Roads were no longer lines of communication. They were pressure points. A single aircraft passing overhead could empty them. Vehicles froze beneath trees. Columns dissolved into fragments. Timetables, once the backbone of operational planning, turned into liabilities because they demanded movement at predictable hours. The Allies understood the psychology quickly. Force vehicles to hide, and everything that depends on them waits. Fuel does not arrive. Orders are delayed. Reserves miss their moment. The battlefield begins to govern itself, not through direct engagement, but through hesitation imposed from above. Air power no longer needed to win every fight. It only needed to interrupt enough of them. On the ground, this change altered trust. Allied infantry and armoured units began to see the sky as an extension of their own reach. Artillery, reconnaissance, and interdiction merged into a single, layered pressure. When resistance stiffened, pilots were overhead. When movement stalled, it was because the enemy dared not move. The presence of aircraft, even unseen, reshaped expectations on both sides of the line. The German commander underestimated one subtle but decisive point. Allied pilots were not searching for insignia, rank, or intention. They were searching for behavior. A vehicle's meaning was revealed not by who rode inside, but by how it moved across space. Confidence, discipline, efficiency, traits once admired in a professional army, had become markers of value from the air. For a pilot scanning the landscape, recognition came in moments too small to record in reports. A brief flash of windshield in the sun, a clean line of travel along a road that others avoided, a car that maintained its lane rather than weaving like civilian traffic or frightened supply trucks. These were not certainties. They were probabilities. But war at altitude was built on probabilities applied repeatedly. With each successful strike, confidence hardened. The battlefield felt increasingly readable. Movement created signatures, patterns repeated. The enemy adapted, but not fast enough to erase the advantage. Air superiority ceased to be a condition that required constant proof. It became an assumption, a certainty reinforced by daily experience. This shift carried its own danger. Confidence can drift toward arrogance. The belief that the system always reveals itself can dull caution and sharpen routine. Yet in Normandy, the evidence continued to support the belief. Roads emptied when aircraft appeared, vehicles scattered. Time itself seemed to slow on the German side. The balance had tilted decisively. What had once been contested space was now governed space. And as Allied pilots grew more certain of what they were seeing, German commanders grew less certain of how to move unseen. Somewhere ahead, on an unremarkable stretch of road, those two forms of confidence were already moving toward each other. The strike came without warning, because warning was no longer part of the system. One moment the staff car held the road, engine steady, the world compressed into forward motion. The next, gunfire tore downward from low altitude, stitching metal and glass with mechanical precision. The windshield shattered inward, the hood buckled, sound collapsed into impact. In those seconds, the abstract danger of air power became violently specific. Inside the car, control vanished. The commander was thrown forward, then sideways, his body no longer an instrument of decision, but an object subjected to force. Pain arrived without explanation. Blood blurred the interior. The war he had been trying to manage from maps and reports reduced itself to heat, noise, and the sudden knowledge that nothing more could be done to stop what was happening. An aide reacted before understanding. He pulled at a door that no longer opened cleanly, dragged the commander clear of twisted metal, and lowered him into the ditch beside the road. The world narrowed to essentials: breathing, bleeding. Time measured not in minutes, but in whether the aircraft would return. Orders were irrelevant. Rank was invisible. Survival became the only hierarchy that mattered. For the driver, the moment had unfolded as a calculation made under pressure no training could fully prepare for: stop and become a stationary target, swerve and risk overturning, accelerate and trust speed against fire from above. The choice lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet contained the weight of consequence. He did not choose correctly or incorrectly. He chose, and the war responded. Above them, the pilot completed the pass and pulled up. He circled once, not to savor the result, but to confirm it. Smoke. A halted vehicle. Figures on the roadside. Satisfied, he turned away and rejoined the pattern of patrol. There were other roads, other movements. The air war did not linger over outcomes. It recorded them, then moved on. This was not cruelty, it was system. Air interdiction was not built on individual victories, but on accumulation. The pilot would not know who lay wounded below, and it did not matter. The objective had been achieved. Movement had been punished. The network had been disrupted. The effect would ripple outward long after the sound of engines faded. For the German command structure, the wounds inflicted on the roadside were deeper than flesh. The commander's absence would create a gap no staff map could easily fill. Decisions waiting for his judgment would stall or be altered. Subordinates would hesitate, unsure how far to act without confirmation. Authority, once centralized in a familiar presence, would diffuse unevenly, losing sharpness with each step. A medical chain formed quickly, improvised from necessity. Field treatment came first, pressure applied, assessments made in clipped phrases. Then transport, hurried and cautious, timed against the fear of renewed attack. Whispers replaced certainty. Words like serious and stable circulated, carefully avoiding those that carried finality. No one said irreversible, though the possibility hung silently over every movement. As the commander was carried away from the road, his war changed irrevocably. He would no longer shape events through presence or command. He would endure them. Pain dictated attention. Uncertainty replaced authority. The battle he now faced offered no maps, no reserves, no room for maneuver, only endurance, and the hope that time would grant recovery before irrelevance set in. Around the wreck, the road resumed its uneasy stillness. Other vehicles would soon approach, hesitate, then divert. The landscape absorbed the incident without ceremony. Another interruption logged into the quiet arithmetic of air power. Another example of how quickly control could be removed, not by defeat, but by interruption. For the commander, the struggle had narrowed to survival. He could not issue orders or correct deployments. He could only wait, suspended between recovery and consequence. The seconds of violence were already over. Their years of effect were just beginning. And as he was carried farther from the front he had insisted on seeing, the war moved on without him, indifferent, unpaused, already calculating the cost of his sudden absence. News of the strike did not travel cleanly. In some units, word arrived quickly, short, clipped messages that said only that the commander had been wounded. In others, there was silence. Phones rang without answers. Radios carried fragments stripped of context. Into these gaps, rumor flowed naturally, expanding to fill the absence of certainty. He was dead. He was returning. He had been removed. Each version reflected not knowledge, but anxiety. At headquarters, the chain of command tightened and strained under sudden load. Orders still went out, but the signatures were unfamiliar. Voices on the telephone lacked the weight of established authority. Even tone became a variable. Where confidence had once been assumed, it now had to be performed. Staff officers adjusted instinctively, choosing words more carefully, sensing that language itself had become a form of leadership. Decisions that once took minutes now took hours, not because information was missing, but because permission was unclear. Authority had not vanished, but it was being reassembled in motion, even as the front continued to shift. Each pause created another pause downstream. A reserve waited. A unit hesitated. A window closed. None of these delays were dramatic. Together, they were decisive. German units responded as they had learned to respond, by adapting. Camouflage was intensified. Movement was pushed deeper into night. Columns were broken into smaller elements, dispersed to reduce visibility. These measures worked, briefly, but each carried cost. Night movement exhausted crews and confused coordination. Dispersion weakened concentration of force. Camouflage slowed reaction. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise eroded tempo. The commander's staff worked to preserve continuity. Maps were kept updated. Standing orders were reissued. Familiar routines were maintained as long as possible, as if repetition itself could hold the structure together. Yet war punished impersonation. No substitute carried authority in quite the same way. No voice on the line could replicate the weight of decisions once made without hesitation. In one small office, a junior officer read an order twice, not because it was unclear, but because something in it felt uncertain. The phrasing was careful, the timing vague, the confidence implied rather than stated. He sensed, without being able to articulate it, that the system issuing the order was no longer sure of itself. It was a subtle recognition, but it lingered. Across the front, the absence registered not as shock, but as friction. Requests took longer to answer. Coordination slipped by degrees. Units began to act conservatively, guarding their own sectors, rather than contributing to a larger plan that felt increasingly abstract. Initiative narrowed. Responsibility contracted. No single failure announced itself, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Allied pressure exploited this naturally, without needing to identify its cause. Attacks landed where response was slowest. Probes found seams that did not close in time. Air patrols continued to impose delay, compounding uncertainty already present on the ground. The German system, designed for coordination under stress, now operated under stress without coordination. The wounded commander remained absent, and absence proved heavier than presence had ever been. His name still appeared on documents. His intent was still referenced in meetings. But intent without enforcement dissolved quickly. Plans assumed his return. Time did not. At every level, officers adjusted their expectations downward. What could be achieved became what could be held. What could be held became what could be abandoned without collapse. The front did not break all at once. It softened, then thinned, then began to give way under pressure applied steadily and without pause. The struggle widened beyond any single individual. The system had lost its anchor, and in war, systems drift when not held in place. The commander's absence was not felt as tragedy or betrayal. It was felt as delay. And in a battle governed by speed, delay was not neutral. It accumulated quietly, minute by minute, decision by decision, until the difference between holding and losing could no longer be recovered. And somewhere beyond headquarters walls, the battlefield continued to move, indifferent to explanations, measuring cost not in intent, but in time. German forces did not stop adapting. Under pressure, they attempted to innovate tactically, reshaping habits that had once been second nature. Movements were broken into smaller elements. Decisions were pushed downward, away from centralized headquarters that had become vulnerable to interruption. Local counterattacks were timed to darkness, planned around brief windows when aircraft could not easily interfere. These changes were not signs of collapse, but of a system struggling to survive in altered conditions. Yet innovation carried limits that could not be crossed. No amount of decentralization could fully compensate for an enemy able to observe and strike movement by day with near impunity. The daylight hours still belonged to Allied aircraft, and with them came the power to interrupt, delay, and punish. German units could adjust how they moved, but not when the sky allowed movement to occur. Allied tactics evolved with equal speed, guided by experience rather than theory. Patrol routes were refined to pass repeatedly over choke points, bridges, junctions, narrow roads where traffic inevitably compressed. Attacks focused less on dramatic destruction and more on predictable logistics. A bridge damaged even temporarily forced rerouting. A junction strafed at the right hour could stall an entire sector. Precision replaced spectacle. The battlefield became a contest of systems rather than formations. Visibility opposed concealment. Tempo fought friction. Endurance pressed against collapse. Each side worked within its advantages, but only one could impose rules without negotiation. For the Allies, the sky provided continuity. For the Germans, concealment offered only interruption. Within this struggle, the wounded commander assumed symbolic weight beyond his rank. His removal from the road illustrated a rule that no directive could override. The sky was no longer background. It was command pressure made physical. Every order now carried an unspoken question. How would it move? And when would it be seen? On patrol, a pilot glanced down at a burning vehicle beside a hedgerow. He did not circle. He did not record names. He moved on, already scanning for the next disruption. The larger victory was not the wreck itself, but the pause it imposed, the hesitation spreading outward as other drivers slowed, stopped, or diverted. Network effects mattered more than individual targets. German commanders began to understand this in fragments. The problem was not a single wrong turn or an unlucky encounter. It was the belief that one could still travel normally in an abnormal war. That routine movement could be preserved through caution alone. That concealment, applied carefully enough, could restore predictability. Instead, every adaptation introduced new friction. Smaller movements took longer. Decentralized decisions risked incoherence. Night operations exhausted troops and eroded coordination. Innovation preserved survival, but at the cost of momentum. The system remained alive, but increasingly brittle. Allied ground forces sensed the shift. Resistance stiffened in places, but it lacked rhythm. Counterattacks arrived late or in isolation. Supplies thinned not from destruction alone, but from delay. The enemy still fought with skill and discipline, but no longer with the tempo needed to regain initiative. Air interdiction did not defeat the German army outright. It constrained it until defeat became cumulative. Understanding changed gradually. What first appeared as bad luck revealed itself as structure. The wounded commander's fate was no anomaly. It was an example. A warning written in wreckage that leadership could not safely connect to its own front lines under constant observation. Innovation continued because it had to. But innovation without freedom of movement could only slow decline, not reverse it. The sky dictated terms, and those terms were unforgiving. As German forces adjusted again and again, the battlefield absorbed each change and responded. The contest was no longer about cleverness alone, but about who defined normal. And in Normandy, normal had shifted upward, into the air, where decisions were enforced before they could be argued on the ground. As the commander lay recovering, the front did not pause. Time, indifferent to injury and rank, pressed forward with steady force. Healing moved at a human pace. War did not. Each day spent away from command widened the gap between what could still be corrected and what had already passed beyond reach. Strategic repair, like physical recovery, demanded time the situation no longer offered. German defences across Normandy fractured unevenly. What had once been a continuous line hardened into isolated strongpoints separated by growing gaps. Each position held with determination, often skill, but without reliable connection to its neighbours. These gaps were invitations. Allied probes found them, widened them, and flowed through, forcing German units to fight inward rather than forward. Defence became local. Collapse became cumulative. Allied ground forces exploited mobility with methodical confidence. Roads were secured, not merely occupied. Bridges were seized intact where possible, repaired quickly where damaged. Supply lines thickened behind advancing units like a rising tide, turning captured ground into usable ground with remarkable speed. What air power had slowed from above, logistics now accelerated from below. German attempts to respond followed familiar patterns and met familiar obstacles. Reserves were identified on maps, ordered forward, then delayed. Aircraft appeared over junctions. Roads clogged as units waited for clearance or diverted under threat. Traffic congestion multiplied uncertainty. A battalion that should have arrived by morning reached the front at dusk, or not at all. Each delay reduced its relevance. From his bed, the commander received reports that arrived already aged. They described positions that had shifted, bridges that had fallen, opportunities that had closed. He read them with concentration, searching for angles of intervention, but the rhythm was wrong. He was responding to events already concluded. It was like reading about a fire from a locked room, aware of the danger, unable to reach it in time. At one point he asked for maps. They were brought and spread before him, carefully updated, meticulously marked. He studied them in silence, then recognized the truth with a clarity that required no comment. The maps were no longer planning tools. They were records. History documents capturing moments that had already slipped away. The front they described no longer existed in the same form. On the ground, German units fought with discipline and resolve, but increasingly without coordination. Strongpoints held until isolated, then withdrew or were reduced. Counterattacks were planned, then postponed, then abandoned as conditions shifted again. Initiative narrowed to the scale of companies and platoons. At higher levels, command became reactive by necessity. Allied forces sensed this change and pressed it. They did not rush recklessly. They advanced where resistance softened, paused where it stiffened, and relied on air power to disrupt attempts at reorganization. The tempo remained theirs. German responses followed rather than shaped events. Even successful defenses cost time that could not be recovered. The commander understood the pattern as it unfolded. He recognized the strategic logic. Once air power controlled movement, command lost its freedom. Decisions could still be made, but their execution depended on conditions imposed externally. Orders became requests to time, weather, and the sky, none of which answered to authority. This was the turning point, though it did not announce itself with a single defeat. It formed quietly, through accumulation. When command becomes reactive, it rarely recovers initiative. Reaction consumes attention. It shortens horizons. It forces choices between bad options rather than creating good ones. Momentum, once lost, is difficult to regain under pressure. As days passed, the front continued to move, indifferent to recovery schedules and revised plans. Allied units consolidated gains and prepared for the next push. German forces adjusted again, but always one step behind the tempo imposed from above and exploited from below. The commander remained sidelined, watching the distance between intention and outcome widen. His belief that he could still fix the situation faded not into despair, but into recognition. The conditions that had once allowed correction no longer existed. The battlefield had changed its rules, and it enforced them relentlessly. By the time he could think of returning to command, the opportunity to influence the decisive phase had already passed. The front had moved on without waiting for orders, for healing, or for the return of authority. And in that realization lay the quiet conclusion of one struggle and the beginning of another, fought not on roads or maps, but within a system already sliding beyond recovery. As Germany's military situation worsened, pressures that had long simmered beneath the surface began to sharpen. Defeat did not arrive only from the front. It seeped inward, into offices, corridors, and conversations conducted in lowered voices. Whispers of plots circulated alongside loyalty tests. Fear of betrayal became as real as fear of encirclement. In a system built on certainty and obedience, uncertainty demanded explanation, and explanation demanded blame. The wounded commander, confined and silent, became something he had never intended to be, a political object. To some he was still admired, a professional soldier undone by circumstance, a symbol of competence removed at the worst possible moment. To others he was suspect, his absence convenient, his past statements newly uncomfortable. To many he was useful. His name could be shaped to fit narratives already forming, narratives that required figures rather than facts. The regime's instincts, honed through years of survival, turned inward. When external pressure increased, cohesion was enforced not by trust, but by suspicion. Loyalty was measured less by performance than by tone. Questions once tolerated became dangerous. Silence could be read as dissent. Survival no longer depended solely on competence, but on alignment with an increasingly rigid interpretation of reality. The commander's earlier truth-telling now carried new weight. He had warned about shortages. He had spoken plainly about air superiority and its consequences. He had questioned whether resources matched objectives. These statements, once framed as professional assessments, were now reinterpreted. In a system narrowing its tolerance, realism began to resemble disloyalty. Visitors arrived at the sick room with careful expressions. Conversations shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Words were chosen the way soldiers chose cover, deliberately, defensively, aware that exposure carried risk. No one accused him openly. No one needed to. The atmosphere itself delivered the message. Uncertainty had reached him, and he was being measured. Outside the room, the war continued without pause. Allied forces advanced. German units withdrew, regrouped, resisted, and withdrew again. Reports arrived daily, documenting losses and delays. The ground truth did not wait for political clarity. It pressed forward, indifferent to internal maneuvering and personal reputations. History did not slow to accommodate suspicion. Inside leadership circles, however, the focus shifted. Failure demanded explanation, and explanation demanded narratives that preserved the system's legitimacy. Individual figures became symbols of loyalty, of weakness, of misplaced confidence. The wounded commander, absent from the front and unable to defend his decisions through action, was increasingly vulnerable to reinterpretation. He sensed the shift without needing confirmation. The questions he was asked changed in tone. They probed less about the front and more about intention, less about logistics and more about belief. He answered carefully, aware that precision no longer guaranteed safety. The ground beneath him, political rather than physical, had become unstable. The second shock lay not in accusation, but in exclusion. Decisions continued to be made without him, even as his name lingered in discussion. He was consulted less frequently. Information arrived later, filtered more heavily. The war he had once tried to influence through presence now moved entirely beyond his reach. The airstrike had removed him from the road. Politics now removed him from relevance. This convergence tightened the narrative. The same moment that had stripped him of mobility also stripped him of influence at precisely the moment when influence mattered most. He was alive, conscious, and informed, yet increasingly irrelevant to the machinery that determined outcomes. The system had adapted to his absence faster than it ever had to his presence. The irony was quiet and complete. He had insisted on seeing the front because he believed leadership required proximity to reality. Now, reality continued without him, both on the battlefield and in the corridors of power. His recovery, measured in days and weeks, did not align with the tempo of collapse or suspicion. Outside, artillery thundered, aircraft passed overhead, units fought and retreated. Inside, words were weighed, reputations recalculated, and futures quietly sealed. Two wars ran in parallel, one of movement and fire, the other of memory and judgment. The second, no less dangerous, offered fewer defenses. The climax formed not through confrontation, but through removal. The commander was no longer positioned to shape the final moments where decisions might still matter. He had been displaced first by violence, then by narrative. His fate, once tied to the front, was now entangled with a system searching for explanations it could accept. And as the war outside ground forward, indifferent and unstoppable, the sick room became a boundary. Beyond it, events unfolded. Within it, the commander waited, aware that the most consequential decisions of his career were now being made in rooms he would never enter again. The commander's physical recovery never truly caught up with events. His wounds healed unevenly, strength returning in fragments rather than wholes. Even as he regained mobility, the space around him narrowed. The danger he now faced was no longer measured in altitude or caliber, but in proximity to power. The political atmosphere surrounding him had turned fully hostile, and it did not require speed to be lethal. After the failed assassination attempt against Hitler, paranoia hardened into policy. What had once been suspicion became procedure. The regime no longer asked whether threats existed. It assumed they did, and searched relentlessly for proof. Associations were examined, statements reinterpreted, absences interrogated. Loyalty was no longer demonstrated by action alone, but by conformity to a tightening narrative. In this climate, meaning shifted. Association became evidence, reputation became liability, silence became survival, until silence itself was interpreted as guilt. The system did not need certainty, it needed alignment. And anyone who stood slightly apart, whether by injury, temperament, or earlier honesty, found himself exposed. The commander's name entered this machinery without ceremony. It did not matter how or why. Perhaps it was mentioned in a report. Perhaps it surfaced through rumor. Perhaps convenience alone placed it there. Once inside, momentum replaced intent. Files accumulated. Questions multiplied. Context was stripped away, leaving fragments arranged to suggest inevitability. His earlier record was re-examined through a distorted lens. Warnings he had issued about resources and air power were now reframed as pessimism. Professional candor became political risk. Realism, once tolerated as competence, now sounded dangerously close to dissent. The same clarity that had guided his command now worked against him. Visitors became fewer and more guarded. Conversations shortened. Even familiar faces spoke with restraint, as if each sentence were being measured by unseen listeners. The walls themselves seemed attentive. He understood then that the war he faced now followed different rules. There were no maps that could explain it, no tactics that could resolve it once suspicion took hold. The moment arrived quietly. A knock at the door, firm and unmistakable. It carried a weight heavier than artillery because it announced finality without violence. No explosions, no warning passes, just procedure, arriving on time. The war on the roads had been sudden. This one was deliberate. He was informed, not accused. Language was precise, almost courteous. Orders were presented as necessity, not judgment. The machinery did not argue, it processed. In that efficiency lay its cruelty. There was no room for explanation, only compliance. Resistance would confirm suspicion. Silence would be recorded. This was the moral peak of the story, though it offered no spectacle. War did not only kill on roads beneath open sky. It killed in rooms, with paperwork and threats, with signatures and sealed decisions. The violence was administrative, but its outcomes were irreversible. The battlefield had followed him home. The irony was complete. The commander who had tried to vanish from Allied fighters, who had concealed rank, minimized exposure and trusted discipline, could not vanish from his own state. The system he had served proved more thorough than the enemy he had tried to evade. Visibility returned in a different form, enforced not by aircraft, but by authority unchecked by doubt. His fate, once tied to operational decisions and battlefield movement, now rested entirely outside military logic. The convergence was total: defeat at the front, suspicion at the center, and an individual caught where the two met. The airstrike had removed him from command. Politics now removed him from protection. There was no redemption arc, no final command issued from defiance. Only recognition. The understanding that systems under extreme pressure consume not only enemies, but servants who no longer fit their needs. The war's final judgment was not delivered by gunfire, but by alignment enforced too late to question. Outside, the conflict continued its relentless course. Allied forces advanced. German positions collapsed or surrendered. History moved forward, indifferent to individual reckonings. Inside the system, however, the process completed itself with careful speed. The commander's attempt to survive modern war by disappearing had failed twice, once under the open sky and once behind closed doors. The first failure removed his body from the battlefield. The second removed his name from the future he had tried to shape. And with that convergence, the story crossed its final threshold, leaving behind not a mystery, but a warning about what war demands and what it ultimately takes. The airstrike's immediate effect was visible and contained: a wrecked staff car by the roadside, a wounded man carried away from the front. It was an event easily logged, easily forgotten amid the volume of daily destruction. Yet its larger effect spread quietly, outward and forward, creating a vacuum not of personnel, but of tempo. What was destroyed was not only a vehicle, but the rhythm by which decisions had once moved. German operational coherence did not collapse because of one incident. It deteriorated because the system could no longer afford interruption. Earlier in the war, delays could be absorbed. Commanders could recover lost time. Units could resynchronize. By the summer of 1944, that margin was gone. Every pause compounded the next. Every absence created friction that no longer resolved itself. In this context, Allied air superiority took on a new meaning. It was not simply dominance in the sky, it became a form of strategic gravity. Everything the German system attempted to lift, reserves, supplies, authority, initiative, was pulled back down. Movement required effort out of proportion to its result. Progress demanded risk that could not be justified repeatedly. The sky imposed weight on every decision. At headquarters, this reality manifested in subtle ways. Orders multiplied, but their effect diminished. A staff clerk filed new directives, aware that the paper itself now carried more confidence than the system enforcing it. Ink replaced momentum. Documentation substituted for control. The machinery of command continued to operate, but its outputs no longer guaranteed outcomes. The destruction extended beyond headquarters and command posts. It reached into the daily experience of those moving beneath the air threat. Pilots flew patrols as part of routine, their work precise and procedural. They did not know the names of those they delayed or wounded. They measured success in disrupted traffic and empty roads. Their contribution was cumulative, not personal. On the ground, soldiers endured movement as ordeal. Each journey became a calculation. Each road crossing demanded vigilance. Fatigue deepened as night replaced day for logistics and redeployment. Units arrived late, scattered, or not at all. Combat did not only exhaust through fighting, it exhausted through waiting, through the constant tension of being seen, Civilians lived beside roads that had become targets. What once connected villages now attracted danger. Farmers paused their work when aircraft passed. Families learned to read the sky instinctively, adjusting routines around patrol patterns they could not influence. Modern war erased the distinction between military and civilian space, not through intention, but through geography. Within this widening circle of consequence, the commander's career assumed a different measure. It was no longer defined by victories achieved or plans executed. It was defined by what he could not prevent as the system failed around him. His removal from the battlefield did not cause collapse, but it removed one more layer of resistance against it. His absence mattered because the margin for error had vanished. The fighters overhead did not destroy command in a dramatic sense. They eroded it. They introduced delay where speed was essential, uncertainty where clarity was required, hesitation where initiative once existed. This erosion accumulated until control became theoretical rather than practical. The front continued to exist, but it no longer responded coherently to intention. This was the deeper consequence of air interdiction. It punished leadership not only at the front, but in transit, between decisions. It targeted the spaces where authority moved, where coordination traveled, where presence once corrected error. Roads, bridges, and junctions became pressure points not because of who used them, but because of what they enabled. The German system had been built on movement, of units, of commanders, of ideas translated quickly into action. When movement became liability, the system inverted itself. Survival replaced initiative. Documentation replaced momentum. Reaction replaced design. None of this required decisive battles. It required patience and persistence from above. For the Allies, this realization reshaped confidence. They no longer needed to imagine the enemy as a single mass to be defeated. They understood him as a network to be slowed. Every delayed vehicle, every abandoned route, every hesitant movement reinforced the same effect. Gravity did the rest. For the commander, the meaning of his wounding extended beyond personal fate. It illustrated a principle he had confronted too late. Modern war did not merely seek to defeat leadership, it sought to interrupt it, to prevent leaders from connecting thought to action in time for thought to matter. The wrecked car by the roadside was only the visible sign. What was truly destroyed was the assumption that command could move freely through a battlefield dominated by air. That authority could travel safely between decisions. That experience and discipline could compensate for exposure. By the time this truth settled fully, it no longer needed to be argued. The system itself reflected it in delays, gaps, and missed opportunities. The fighters had done their work not by knowing who they struck, but by knowing what to strike. And as consequence settled across Normandy, one conclusion became unavoidable. In modern war, leadership is not only tested at the front, it is tested on the roads between intentions, where interruption, not defeat, decides the outcome. Plain sight had once meant safety through anonymity. In earlier wars, to appear ordinary was to disappear. A commander who shed ceremony and insignia could move among the machinery of war without attracting attention, protected by the assumption that danger searched for prominence. By 1944, that assumption no longer held. The meaning of anonymity had reversed. What once concealed importance now revealed it through predictability. The commander understood concealment. He hid rank, altered routes, traveled early, and reduced his profile to the bare minimum. Every precaution reflected discipline rather than carelessness. Yet none of it changed the central fact of the new battlefield. Movement itself was a signal. To travel was to declare necessity. And necessity, viewed from the air, was readable. The Allies did not need to know who was inside a vehicle to change the course of events. Identity had become secondary. Function was enough. A staff car represented command in motion, decisions travelling toward the front, authority attempting to reconnect with action. Destroy the car, and the system lost coherence regardless of the individual wounded inside. Control, not personality, was the true target. This was the deeper irony. The commander's personal discipline operated at the level of the individual. The enemy's advantage operated at the level of structure. Air dominance, surveillance, and rapid response formed a system that no amount of individual caution could outmaneuver. Skill met architecture, and architecture prevailed. From the pilot's perspective, the encounter resolved itself with procedural calm. A vehicle identified by behavior rather than identity. A pass executed at low altitude, a result confirmed. Later, the debrief reduced the event to coordinates, altitude, ammunition expended. The wreck on the road, the confusion, the blood, the sudden collapse of command, existed only as data. Modern killing did not require intimacy. It required compliance with process. That contrast revealed something fundamental about 20th century warfare. Violence had become routinized, distanced from its consequences by technology and repetition. The pilot did not need to understand what had been disrupted on the ground. The system ensured that disruption occurred. Cause and effect were separated by altitude, speed, and procedure. This separation raised a moral question that emerged quietly, without accusation. If technology made killing easier, did it also make accountability easier, or easier to avoid? Responsibility diffused across layers of command and machinery. Orders were lawful. Actions were correct. Outcomes were devastating. No single individual owned the result, yet the result was irreversible. On the ground, the effects were immediate and tangible. The removal of command presence slowed decisions, fractured coordination, and narrowed options. Units adapted, but always too late to regain momentum. The pilot moved on to the next patrol. The road absorbed another interruption. The system registered another success. The commander, viewed in retrospect, became a measure of limits rather than failure. He had attempted to apply individual excellence to a structural transformation in warfare. He believed experience could outrun observation, and discipline could negotiate exposure. He was not reckless. He was operating within a logic that no longer applied. Plain sight now meant something else entirely. To be ordinary was not to be invisible, it was to be legible. Predictable movement created patterns. Patterns invited interpretation. Interpretation invited action. The sky did not judge intent, it processed behavior. Legacy then shifted away from terrain held or orders issued. It moved toward control of visibility. The future would belong to those who shaped what could be seen, when it could be seen, and how quickly action followed observation. Ground without concealment became temporary. Command without protected movement became fragile. This lesson extended beyond one commander and one road. It marked a broader transition in war itself. Surveillance collapsed the distance between seeing and striking. The interval in which leadership could safely operate narrowed until it almost vanished. Presence, once a source of authority, became a liability. The irony rested in the commander's final calculation. He tried to disappear into routine, believing normality would shield him. Instead, routine betrayed him. By behaving as a functional part of a system still attempting to operate, he placed himself precisely where the enemy's logic was strongest. In the end, plain sight did not mean unseen. It meant exposed through necessity, through the simple act of moving in a war that punished movement itself. The sky had learned to read what the ground could not hide, and as Normandy taught its final lessons, one truth settled with quiet clarity. The future of war would not belong merely to those who held ground, but to those who controlled visibility above it. The story returns to the road. It looks unchanged, narrow, pale with dust, bordered by hedgerows that give no hint of danger. There are no markers to explain its importance. Yet by the summer of 1944, this ordinary landscape obeyed an extraordinary rule. Move in daylight, and the sky would answer. Not always with fire, sometimes with silence that watched, measured, and waited. The commander's decision to travel along it was shaped by urgency rather than defiance. He believed leadership required proximity, that authority detached from the front dissolved into abstraction. There was courage in that belief, and responsibility. There was also a quieter arrogance, the conviction that experience and restraint could still outrun a war that had rewritten its rules. In another phase, his calculation would have been sound. In this one, it was already outdated. He attempted to disappear among common vehicles, shedding ceremony and visibility. No escort announced him, no insignia betrayed rank. He trusted normality to provide cover. But modern battlefields no longer read appearance, they read behavior. A vehicle on a road was no longer neutral. It was a statement of necessity, of function, of connection. Movement itself had meaning. The Allies did not find him in the old sense. There was no spy report, no deliberate hunt for a name or a face. What found him was mathematics, air superiority multiplied by movement. The sky did not need identity, it needed patterns. A car that moved with purpose was enough. A road used at the wrong hour was enough. Control was interrupted not by knowing who he was, but by knowing what his movement represented. His removal rippled outward in ways no strike report could capture. Decisions slowed. Coordination thinned. Authority became reactive rather than directive. The system did not collapse because a man was wounded. It faltered because the connection between thought and action could no longer travel safely. Leadership stranded between intentions lost its leverage over events that moved faster than recovery. This reversal carried a lesson larger than one career. It showed how systems fail when leaders cannot safely connect to their own fronts. Presence, once the currency of command, became a liability. Distance, once a weakness, became protection. The war punished those who tried to bridge the gap physically, when the gap had already shifted upward into the air. The road absorbed the incident without ceremony. Traffic learned new habits. Civilians adjusted their days to the rhythm of engines overhead. Pilots logged another patrol. No one lingered. Modern war did not require memory at the point of contact. It required persistence. The meaning of the strike accumulated elsewhere, in delays, hesitations, and missed windows that no single report could fully explain. For the commander, the end came not with spectacle, but with convergence. Violence removed him from motion. Politics removed him from protection. The same logic that punished movement beneath open sky punished realism within a collapsing state. In both cases, visibility proved fatal, not because he sought attention, but because systems under pressure read difference as risk. The moral weight of the story settles gently, without accusation. There is no need to exaggerate courage or assign villainy. The commander acted within a tradition that valued presence and decisiveness. The Allies acted within a system that valued interruption and control. The tragedy lies in the mismatch between habit and environment, between a form of leadership and a battlefield that no longer accommodated it. In war, invisibility is never guaranteed. It is negotiated briefly under conditions that can change without warning. What protects today may expose tomorrow. Technology compresses time between seeing and striking until judgment becomes procedural. Responsibility diffuses. Outcomes harden. The road remains what it always was, and what it became only briefly. A place where ordinary movement carried extraordinary consequence. The sky remains what it learned to be in 1944, not a backdrop, but an arbiter. Between them moved a man who believed he could still manage the risk by restraint alone. History's final measure is quiet. Not how loudly a moment announced itself, but how clearly it revealed the rules beneath it. He tried to vanish in plain sight, yet the sky had learned to read what the eye could not.